Hello and welcome to today's lecture. Today what we are going to look at is race, ethnicity, and nationalism. So in this section we're going to explore topics which are relevant to the everyday lives of individuals. In order to unpack race and ethnicity, I'd like to first start by looking at the nation state. So in order to talk about the nation state, we need to first secure working understanding of what a state is and what a nation is. So, what is a state? A state, quite simply, is a form of society characterized by a hierarchical ranking of people and a centralized political control. The state is this central political control that is going to not only be the source of laws, but able to enforce the laws themselves. Now, the state has a form, the state has a function, the state can exist outside of any nation in terms of us not needing to believe in it for it to exist. The nation, however, is an extremely abstract term, an extremely abstract concept as well. The nation is a term that retains its connection to ethnicity and refers to a collection of people who share a common language, worldview, and ancestry. Benedict Anderson talks about the nation and he refers to it as being an imagined community. Again, an incredibly abstract idea. The nation does not exist except for us believing that it in fact does exist. Now, when we're speaking about the nation, most people, when talking about Canada, refer to the nation of Canada. I can't think of a time when I've ever heard anyone refer to the state of Canada, but of course, Canada is a state. Canada has a central political authority and a hierarchical ranking of people. Now, the way to think about the state and the relationship with the nation is that the state is this political structure. It forms the bones of this society. And over the bones is draped the flesh of the nation. So the nation makes the state more personable. The nation makes the state relatable. So again, the state is this nondescript bone structure. It is our political authority. It is the hierarchical ranking of people. And over top of that, we drape the flesh of the nation. And the flesh of the nation is, of course, something that makes it very relatable to us. Now, another difference that exists between a state and a nation is that a state can have many nations within it. So, for example, the state of Canada has 3 nations within its control. So we have the nation of Canada, we have First Nations, and then we have the nation of Quebec as well. Now, a nation can extend across many states. So, for example, looking at Canada again, the state of Canada has 3 nations within its control. First Nations, Nation of Canada, and the Nation of Quebec. First Nations, however, at different points along our border, does extend from the state of Canada into the state of the United States. So we have an example of a nation that can cross many or multiple states as well. So they can behave in very different sorts of ways. Again, the state itself is something that's very solid. It has a tangible existence, whereas the nation is very abstract. But the nation takes on this kind of palpable existence because we are socialized to know its symbols, to know cultural heroes, to come to share these world beliefs that are in line with other individuals who also share the nationhood with us. So for most individuals listening to this lecture, they will be either First Nations and Canadian or Canadian, and there might be someone out there who also is from the nation of Quebec. So we all belong to either one or multiple nations. Each nation has symbols that represent it. For the sake of keeping the lecture kind of streamlined, we'll just look to the nation of Canada. So Canada has the flag, which stands as a symbol for us. We have the beaver, we have hockey, beer, maple maple syrup, Tim Hortons, all these things represent the nation of Canada and are very important in not only us understanding that the nation does exist, but they're important in that they make the nation relatable to us. So we have a kind of buy into the nation because it seems personable, because it seems to be in line with our values and our views. Now, when we're thinking about what nation we belong to, it's good to pause and think, how did I come to know this information? How do I know that I'm a Canadian? Where did I first start to learn this? Well, we are, of course, socialized to know what it means to be a Canadian. As a Canadian, we view ourselves as being not as aggressive as Americans. We view ourselves as being polite, intelligent, keepers of nature. We have all these different stereotypes, I guess, is one way of thinking about them, as to what it means to be a Canadian. In school, we're taught how to be good moral citizens. So how to respect authority, how to identify authority, how to react to that authority, how to compartmentalize time, what a work day is, who our cultural heroes are, what our map signifies, where our place is on that map. And so again, school, very important in terms of creating you to be a good and moral citizen. So now we have determined what the state is, which is a form of society characterized by a hierarchical ranking of people, centralized political control, very objective political structure. And then the nation, the term that retains its connection to ethnicity, refers to a collection of people who share a common language, worldview, and ancestry, is just the flesh that is draping over top of the state structure. Now, when we're thinking about how we come to know what nation we're from and what values we should share as members of the nation, ritual plays a very important role in this, as do the symbols of the nation as well. Now, you've already covered ritual when we did the section on religion, and it's been touched on a few times in the course now, but I've put up just a refresher as to what a ritual is before I head into a reading from David Kertzer, where he addresses ritual and he addresses symbolism in terms of the nation. So ritual is composed of a sequence of symbolic activities. They need to be set apart from everyday life, and they need to be recognizable by members of the society. So it isn't just something that's foreign to us, it's something that's recognizable to us, and we know that there's a degree of importance involved in it, and that they are closely connected to a specific set of ideas that are often encoded or associated with mythology of the nation. So when we talk about important dates that we have in Canada, which become very important in terms of nationalism, we have Canada Day, we have Remembrance Day. Remembrance Day in particular, seen as we're approaching or will have already passed, anniversaries, say like Vimy Ridge and different military anniversaries, we look to our military and we speak about the sacrifice that these individuals made, how they embodied the best of what it means to be a Canadian. They protect our rights, they protected our freedoms. And so these individuals become cultural heroes. And ritual is such an important part of sending that message to us. And ritual will make use of symbols at the same time. So the flag, focusing on the poppy, focusing on maple leaves, all these things, again, that stand out as being key things to the Canadian identity. So I want you to think about different days that we have where we use ritual and we use symbols during the ritual to tell us a story about ourselves in terms of what it means to be Canadian. And while you think about that, I'm going to read to you an excerpt from David Kertzer, Ritual, Politics, and Power, where he talks about the power of rights and the usage of symbols as well. So Kertzer states, modern wars depend on a sense of national allegiance, but the nation itself has no palpable existence outside the symbolism through which it is envisioned. The state is invisible and must be personified before it can be seen. symbolized before it can be loved, and imagined before it can be conceived. People subscribe to the master fiction that the world is divided into a fixed number of mutually exclusive nations, and they see these units as part of the nature of things and assume an antiquity that the nations themselves, in fact, lack. This symbolic conception of the universe leads people to believe that everyone has a nationality, in the same sense that everyone has a gender. It is in this light that Benedict Anderson defined a nation as an imagined political community. Far from being window dressing on the reality that is the nation, symbolism is the stuff of which nations are made. Many of the most potent political symbols have a palpable quality to them, making it easier for people to treat concepts as things. This is evident in the metaphors that help define the political universe. For numerous Americans, an iron curtain lies across Europe, separating those on the other side from those in the free world. Similarly, a flag is not simply a decorated piece of cloth, but is in fact the embodiment of a nation. Indeed, the nation is defined as much by the flag as the flag is by the nation. Living in a society which extends well beyond our direct observation, we can relate to the larger political entity only through abstract symbolic means. We are indeed ruled by power holders whom we never encounter except in highly symbolic presentations. And what political environment could be more dependent on symbols than one in which our decision whether to pat a person on the back or shoot him depends on the color of the uniform he wears and the flag that is on that uniform. With the increase in the size of the state and the growth of bureaucracy, politics is transformed from a concrete activity into what Marx once called the fantasy of everyday life. Now, Kertzer, I think, quite powerfully demonstrates how even though the nation is an abstract concept and the nation really doesn't exist except for us believing that it does exist, how powerful the concept can be. So our decision whether to shoot someone or pat them on the back can depend on what flag is on their uniform. I don't think anyone is confused about the fact that the flag is just simply a decorated piece of cloth. But it obviously extends well beyond that. We give it value, we give it meaning. It comes to stand for everything that is important to us. And the flag itself becomes very sacred to the point that people are willing to and have died in order to protect it. So how do we go about creating a nation? Because it's one thing for me to say it's abstract, it only exists if you believe in it. So how is it that we come to believe that the nation, in fact, does exist? Let's take a look at how you create a nation. The first thing that you do is the creation of an other. This is a very important step in terms of creating the nation. So by creating an other, what you do is you create or define a category of people who are deemed to be marginal to the main body of the group. What this does is it allows for members of the group itself to more easily identify with one another. There is a stigma that is attached to being marginalized, and so it regulates the behavior of individuals who are, in fact, a part of the main body of the group. In Canada, we have an easy go-to other. We define ourselves in terms of what it means to be Canadian, often by speaking about what we aren't. And so we'll say we're not aggressive like Americans. We're not arrogant like Americans. We're not, whatever we want to say about an American at that point, we're not that. And so we have the United States as this kind of easy to use other. And by using this other again, we're able to define who we are. And so we know that we're a part of the main body of the group and that we don't want to be like this other category of person. You need to make membership in the nation seem voluntary, but at the same time contractual. So you are born into a nation state and assume the citizenship of one or both of your parents. If you wish to change your membership to another state, you must proceed through a very difficult process. Keep in mind that it is impossible to opt out of allegiance to all states, meaning that you must align yourself with one state at all time, or one state at all times, meaning that you have to either be Canadian, have to be American. You can't just pick up and say tomorrow that you're going to be a human of the world. It's just not possible to do this. And so, because we're born into it, we think that it is voluntary, meaning that I have chosen to be Canadian. The reality is that if I choose to not be Canadian, it is going to be incredibly hard for me to shed my Canadian citizenship and to take on another citizenship. Now, how do we make our membership within the nation seem contractual? One of the things that we can do is that we socialize individuals that they need to behave in a certain way and that they need to have actions that are seen to be moral and proper for members of that society. And so we, at that point, understand that in order to be a Canadian, this is what's expected of me. And any of you who have traveled outside of the country have experienced this, where as soon as someone identifies you as being a Canadian, or as soon as you find yourself somewhere close to where our easy go-to other, an American, is, you'll go out of your way to be overly polite, overly kind, all these different sorts of things that, again, we hold to be of value in Canada. And so we almost have a little checklist of things that contractually we must do if we want to be recognized as a valuable moral member of this society. We also tell individuals within our society that it is not only your right, but it is your duty to vote. And so we say, listen, there are things at times that we require of you. And while you do, in theory, have the option as to whether or not you're going to vote, you will be reminded by people that individuals lost their lives just so you could have that freedom. So the very least that you could do is to go out and vote and to basically honor the sacrifice that they made. So again, at times we will say to people that there are certain things we require, with quotes around it, of them if they want to be a valuable moral member of this society. You define race categories. By defining race categories, what you can do is apply privilege to some individuals while marginalizing others. According to Stats Canada, there are in fact 3 races in Canada. The 3 races that they list are Aboriginal and Caucasian. Those are the first 2. The third race category that they have is visible minority. Now, visible minorities is a very interesting racial category because it is based on skin color, based on religion, and based on country of origin. So this is a race category, but you can see it is pretty wide open in terms of how they're determining if someone is a visible minority or if they're not a visible minority, which should cause you to question race and racial categories. But of course, we'll get back to this at the end of the lecture when we address race. The fourth thing you need to do in the creation of the nation is create a common language. Common languages help individuals communicate in a cohesive manner while also creating a means to identify those who are not clearly in full membership of the nation. So in Canada, we have English and French as our 2 languages. So even though we are a multicultural society, we are only bilingual in terms of our language. And that should be a red flag again that we will address when we come to multiculturalism in just a couple of minutes here. But in Canada, we've said French and English are our 2 official languages. So as I'm speaking to you right now, there is no reason for you to question whether or not I am Canadian. If I was speaking to you in French, or if I was speaking to you and had a French accent, again, no reason to question whether or not I am Canadian. You may ask what part of Canada I'm from. Are you from New Brunswick, Quebec, or another area of Canada where we have a French community? So that may be of interest to you, but you're not going to necessarily question whether I'm Canadian or not. But if I was speaking to you and I had a Spanish accent, the first thing that comes to mind with most people is, when did you come to Canada? Why did you come to Canada? How long have you been here? Basically saying to me that I'm not seeing you first and foremost as being a member of this nation. So the fact that we said English and French are our two official languages allows us to marginalize individuals who aren't speaking those two languages, or aren't doing so without accents that we don't identify as being Canadian. Now, this is problematic in that for individuals who have come from other areas and want to be Canadians, they will have a very hard time doing that. It'll be next to impossible for them to become what's referred to as kind of the invisible Canadian, which is what I am. No one ever asks me if I am Canadian or not. I just kind of slide under the radar. And so forever, individuals with accents are going to be asked, where did you come from? Why did you choose to come to Canada? When I was doing my graduate studies at Carleton, I got into a cab with a fellow grad student, and she looked at the cab driver, looked at his skin color, looked at his name, and asked him as we were traveling along, how long have you been in Canada? Why did you come to Canada? How long have you been in Canada? And without skipping a beat, he said, well, I've been in Canada for 47 years. And I looked at her and I said, well, he's a better Canadian than you are. And she said, well, what do you mean he's a better Canadian? I said, well, he's been being a Canadian much longer than you've been alive. He's been performing everything that it means to be a Canadian, 20 more years than you have been around. So it's kind of funny in a way to ask someone who's been performing what it means to be a Canadian longer than you. How, when did you come to Canada? How long have you been in Canada? Why did you choose to come here? Arguably, this guy is, with quotes around again, a better Canadian than you are. And you can imagine for individuals who hear this day in, day out, that it's very difficult for them to see themselves wholly and completely as being Canadians, because they're constantly being marginalized. They're constantly being challenged. A few semesters ago, I had a student from China come up to me and say, if she could have one wish, it would be for her to exist as an invisible Canadian. She said, all I want is to go even just one day without people asking me, where are you from and why did you come here? She said, every time they ask me that, she said, it's like a dagger in my heart, because it's saying to me, I'm not quite Canadian. And for her, this was tough to deal with, and rightly so. You can see how this marginalization or group cohesiveness that at times we challenge people on, how that can be very difficult for them to handle. So the fifth thing you do in the creation of the nation: facilitate travel from one area of the country to another. This creates a degree of solidarity. Another important thing that it does is allows for consumer goods to travel from one part of a country or from one part of the country to another, and it also allows us to protect our national borders. So while the roadways and the railways are in place to move us around and to move goods around, more importantly, they're in place to allow us to mobilize our military. There's no point in us having national borders if we can't protect them. And so we need to know that we can get our military there in a speedy amount of time in order to defend the borders that are in place. You build a national media. Building a national media allows for the transmission of national ideas and values. CBC is our national media in Canada. And if you listen to CBC, what you will hear are, what our languages are, who Canadian bands are, what books we should be reading, who the cultural heroes are in Canada, what things we should be focused on as Canadians. So it is almost a little guidebook on how to be Canadian. So the national media allows for the transmission of national ideas and values. The taxation infrastructure. This taxation infrastructure must be seen as necessary to maintain the nation in a way which benefits you best. You pay your taxes to the state of Canada, but you, in many ways, think that you are paying them to the nation itself. And so you often feel as though, while you may not overly enjoy paying your taxes, at least these taxes are being used to sustain the nation in a way that your values and the values of the nation are being upheld. So money going to healthcare, money going to education, etc. You create a national education system. Ernest Gellner says that more important than controlling any country's military is the controlling of their education. The national education system is done obviously to improve the knowledge of the citizens, but more importantly, it's actually in place to help socialize children on how to be good citizens. And so the education system, again, tells us our place on the map. It gives us our language, gives us our history, gives us a lot of what our worldview will continue to be throughout our adult lives. So the national education system, very, very important in the creation of citizens. Number 8, number 9, create a police and or military force. Now, the military force is in place and the police force is in place so that people feel as though they are protected from internal and external threats, while also making them believe that they need to act in a certain way in order for them to avoid having the force used against them. So the police or military force is there to protect us. It's there to regulate our behavior. It's there to make us feel safe from external threats so that we don't feel as though our borders are going to be challenged, or if they're going to be challenged, we are in a safe position because of this military or police force, which is representing and protecting our rights and our needs. Now, we come to the interesting section where we are going to mash together the nation and the state. So when did the nation-state union begin? Well, the nation-state union began around, would be around the 1600s, where we have states which were already in existence starting to try and expand the control that they had over their regions or over their areas. Most people in the 1500s, 1600s didn't really care about a national identity. They weren't thinking in terms of, I'm living in Canada, I'm living in Britain, I'm living in Scotland. They had their focus basically on local concerns. So their only concern was that Olga down the street has sugar, so if I need to borrow a cup of sugar, I can go to her and get that from her. I didn't care at this time whether or not there was someone who lived 300 kilometers away from me, because I was never going to travel there. I was never going to see them, and I was never going to be affected by their presence. But as the state, the political units, started to take control back from landowners, they needed to bring together in a cohesive manner. And this is where we see the birth of the nation state really start to emerge. The nation state, as we see it now, did not exist in the form that we know it as for more than really little over 100 years. Even as of 1788, when the United States ratified its Constitution, there was only 20 nation states in existence. So as of 1788, we're only seeing 20 nation states in existence. And obviously after that time, more and more started to emerge. So what is the importance of the nation state? Well, the importance of the nation state is that the nation state itself is really focused on trade and the economic lives of its citizens. So Eric Wolf highlights that the nation state really began to develop and take shape as a new partnership that was formed between the ruling elite and the merchant class. And so we have this nation state blending where the nation state is now concerned about the use of taxation, is concerned about the use of military force to secure markets in other parts of the world. So the modern nation state is trying to promote and regulate trade. The modern nation state, in many ways, has become the guardian of the national economy, functioning largely to advance the economic lives of citizens. So again, the nation state as we see it now has not existed in the form that we know it as for more than, say, just a little over 100 years. It's relatively new to the political landscape. And here's a tight little breakdown of what the difference is between the nation, between the state, and between what we now have, which is the most dominant political unit in the world, the nation state. So the state, as we started with, is the legal political entity that is comprised of the following: a permanent population, defined territory, central political authority in the form of the government, and a capacity to enter into relations with other states. The nation refers only to a socio-cultural entity, a union of people who can share identity culturally and linguistically, and this concept does not necessarily consider formal political unions, meaning that the nation is an abstract idea, it becomes a draping over top of the state itself. The nation state is the meshed or the mashed together union of the political unit with a group of people who share a common culture, history, and also a language as well. So we're going to look at whether Canada is multicultural or whether it is a cultural melting pot. All right, so this is a big question that we need to address. Often one of the things that we say in terms of what makes Canada special is that it is multicultural. And so we say we're different than the United States. We respect diversity. We are a cultural mosaic. Everyone here gets to have their own identity, and we're not trying to reduce everyone down to just a uniform culture, that we are allowing people to be very, very expressive. So before we look at multiculturalism, we need to, of course, find out what a cultural melting pot is. So a cultural melting pot is a concept which refers to this society that has many different components within it. And so we have this society, think of it in terms of a crayon box. You have all these different colors, and you take that crayon box and you put it into a hot pot and you melt down all the colors and you mix them together, and what you end up with is this kind of slurry that is one color. So you've lost all the vibrancy, you've lost all these distinct colors, and you've made everything the same. And this is what the cultural melting pot is, and the cultural melting pot model that was adopted and used down in the United States. There are people who have suggested that not only did the melting pot take all these different diverse cultures and try to make them into one uniform kind of American culture, but that in fact the melting pot used some cultures as the fire or as as the wood to create the fire to heat the pot. So they took it a step further and said, listen, not only did you throw some people into the pot and try and get rid of their differences and bring them together into a common whole, but you've actually used some cultures as the fuel to heat that pot. And so some people weren't even allowed to come into the pot, that they were just there, to fuel this eventual kind of homogenous melting together of these cultures. Now, did Canada have cultural melting pot thinking as well? Absolutely. We had it in our policies. What makes us a little bit different than the United States, though, is that we weren't as explicit in what we did. Instead, we chose at a certain point in our history to really champion being multicultural. So what is multiculturalism? Now, multiculturalism is a Canadian policy in which all hyphenated cultures, such as African Canadian or French Canadian, are celebrated and described as being a part of a cultural mosaic instead of a cultural melting pot. Now, when we're talking about multiculturalism, again, this is something that we hold to be very important to us as Canadians. And we say that here in Canada, everyone is respected equally. Now, the big question, though, in practice is, do we really respect individuals equally and all individuals? Our multicultural history, some of you may be very surprised to know, did not begin until 1971. So in 1971, Pierre Elliott Trudeau and other policymakers were playing around, 1969 actually is when they really kind of started to bring it together. But in 1971, they're playing around with this idea of having cultural freedom of all individuals and recognition of the contribution of individuals to this Canadian landscape. But they were looking at it from a biculturalism and bilingualism perspective initially. They were looking at British and French elements within the country, and they were trying to give equal footing to both of them. And so what they were saying at this point is that there needs to be a recognition of English parts of our history, recognition of French parts of our history, and that they weren't looking to anything outside of that. Pierre Elliott Trudeau and other policymakers at this time recognized that if they only focused on French and English, though, they were going to anger a lot of other cultures, which also contributed to what Canada was then and, of course, what it is now. So instead of calling it a bilingual or a bicultural policy, they reworded it and referred to it as being a multicultural policy. And so the multicultural policy, again, did not come from this want or this desire to have this cultural mosaic. It was coming from a bicultural perspective, but they had a recognition that, listen, we can't just be that narrow. We need to have a broader stroke with this. So let's talk in terms of multiculturalism. It was hollow, though. It was largely symbolic and it did not have any teeth. So it really did not change anything at all in terms of the lived experience of people. And so we have, I think it was 1988, don't worry about the dates too much with this, but in 1988, we have multiculturalism as a policy re-signed into, our bills on human rights, our laws that protect individuals, and the government of Canada takes an even stronger stance in terms of what multiculturalism means to us as a state. So this is the government of Canada's vision on multiculturalism. So the government of Canada states that all citizens can keep their identities, can take pride in their ancestry, and have a sense of belonging. Acceptance gives Canadians a feeling of security and self-confidence, making them more open to and accepting of diverse cultures, with no pressure for these individuals to assimilate and give up their culture. As they state, immigrants can freely choose their new citizenship simply because they want to be Canadian. So I'm going to reread a section of this and see if you agree with it in practice. And so they say that, again, all citizens can keep their identities, can take pride in their ancestry, and have a sense of belonging with no pressure to assimilate and give up their culture. Immigrants can freely choose their new citizenship because they want to be Canadians. Is there really no pressure for individuals new to Canada to assimilate? Can they truly keep all of their identities? Can they truly keep all of their beliefs and take pride in their ancestry? Or are we asking them to become Canadian in a cultural melting pot sort of way? Ava McKay, when talking about multiculturalism, says even though our multicultural policy allows for this hyphenation in culture, so I can be Ukrainian Canadian, ultimately what the state of Canada and what the nation of Canada expects of us is that our Canadian identity overrides all other identities. So while I can be Ukrainian Canadian, I have to first and foremost be a Canadian. And this is very important to the development of a national identity, which leads us to these thought questions. Now, the first one is incredibly broad, and there's no way we can even begin to address this question completely in this course. There are people that have been thinking about this since 1971, when Canada first started down the road, presenting itself as being one of the first nations in the world to have recognition of multiculturalism, whether or not this can happen. Now, I want you guys to reflect on this, and by all means, you can put this into your blogs also. Do you think that it's possible to have a national identity so long as you also give equal footing to cultural diversity? Meaning, is it possible to have people bonded at the level of national identity if they're also equally bonding to their own separate and unique ethnicities, their own separate cultural groups? Very difficult to do that because there's always this give and take between where your allegiance is. Is it with the nation of Canada or is it with your ethnicity? And so this is for policymakers. This is for people who look to symbolism, who look to rituals, important dates and holidays. They are constantly trying to rework how we present our national identity and how we foster it. Now, the second question as to whether or not there are victims or people who perceive themselves as being victims of multiculturalism, there most definitely is. And you would have really seen this emerge during the election down in the United States. And you would see this pop up in comments when people are addressing multicultural policies or policies in terms of, say, head coverings in public areas. If you're working as a government official, you'll see these comments pop up in the section underneath where there are individuals who are saying that they are a victim of this rampant multiculturalism, that they feel as though their ethnicity is being challenged and taken away from them, and also that they can't feel pride for their own heritage in a way that other people are not only allowed to feel proud for it, but are encouraged to feel proud of their heritage. Now, this victim mentality or this victim way of thinking is referred to as being a white backlash. And so you have many individuals within Canada and the United States as well feeling as though multiculturalism has disempowered them, has threatened their national unity, the identity of their nation, and also the progress of their nation. And this has developed to the extent that we now have people in Canada in particular looking at this hyphenated multicultural policy that we have, and they're saying, okay, you can no longer think in terms of French Canadian or German Canadian. What we want now, if we're going to be a progressive nation and really move forward, is a Canadian policy, meaning that you don't need to discard all aspects of your ethnicity, but that they no longer can have equal footing. That first and foremost, your focus should be on the nation and the nation first. So that takes us through some of the issues surrounding multiculturalism and should hopefully cause you guys to pause and question as to whether or not Canada is a multicultural society or if it is a cultural melting pot. All right, so now we're going to address race and how it is that we define race. Race should be understood as the presumed genetic, natural, heritable characteristics of a group of people based upon skin color, eye color, or hair type. And by presumed, what that means is that race does not exist in biology in the way that we think that it does. There are not separate categories of individuals that exist within our human species. We have not been around long enough to have these discrete races. Race is one of the most controversial issues today, scientifically, socially, and politically. This is something that people are talking about and people are concerned about. And I find it very interesting that even though we know race does not exist in terms of biology, that information is not taught to us at an early age. I teach this every semester to hundreds of students, and every time I talk about race and every time I bring up the fact that discrete races do not exist within the human species, we are all one species. There aren't these separate categories. I say, how many of you were taught that information either in grade school or high school? Out of a class of 100 to 200 students, I'll get 2 to 3 people who raise their hands. That is disgusting, I guess, is the only way you can say this, that information is not being told to us. We should know this. We should be taught from a very young age that while race does not exist in biology, race and our understanding of race does exist as a social and cultural construct. Now, where did this belief come from that races exist? Well, it comes from biology. Biologists use the concept of race to refer to geographically and reproductively isolated populations of species. These isolated populations of species are often referred to as being subspecies. Given enough time and continued isolation, this subspecies will develop into a completely separate species. Now, this type of thinking is applied to human populations. Human populations, though, have never been reproductively isolated long enough to have developed into biologically distinct races. This, of course, has not stopped people from classifying the human species into groups based upon phenotype or observable characteristics. So looking to skin color, hair texture, nose shape, eye color, etc., and saying that these differences are so striking, there is no way I can be genetically similar to that person. What we have done is we've allowed our eyes to fool us. The differences that we see phenotypically, meaning observable features, do not concord to anything deeper within us. They don't concord to characteristics, temperament, musical ability, athletic ability. You know, when we're talking about these differences, they are minute, right? And they don't really matter in terms of anything else. A huge problem with racial classifications as we have them now, and as they are presented to us, is that the criteria for these classifications are in fact arbitrary and subjective. They vary from culture to culture. So in one culture, a skin tone could in fact classify you as being white. You go to a different society, your skin tone is such that people are viewing you as being black. There was a department member at the university who, in the country that he was from, was viewed to be white. When he came to the University of Regina, people were speaking about him as though he was something other than white. And it really confused him because his whole life in the country that he was from, he was talked about as white, treated as though he was white. And now that he was here, he was most definitely not being seen as white. And that really shook him to his core. So again, the racial classifications and the criteria that we use are arbitrary and objective. So where do these differences come from? Because again, we can see that the differences exist. Most phenotypic traits exist because they had an adaptive ability. So the environment itself will select positively or negatively for certain traits that people have. And so, for example, the pigment melanin, which will determine the color of your skin, whether your skin's light or whether your skin is dark. The pigment melanin absorbs and disperses radiation. So if you have more melanin, the darker your skin will be. And this is beneficial if you are in a region where there is long exposure to the sun, or the sun exposure has a very high intensity. So you want to protect yourself from the radiation, from the damage that comes from that, and from skin cancer. So if you have dark skin, the reason you have dark skin is because your ancestors at some point were in a region where they needed to be protected from this radiation damage. So individuals within that society at that time who had dark skin had a higher reproductive success, which means that that phenotypic feature just multiplied. Now, individuals who have lighter skin, what that means is that your ancestors came from an area where they needed to have lighter skin in order to allow for the absorption of vitamin D into their bodies. So they came from an area where it was cloudy, where they did not have a large amount of sun exposure. So when they did have sun, they needed to have that lighter skin in order to get the vitamin D for their health. And so people with lighter skin in that area at that time would have had higher reproductive success rate. So difference comes down to geography. It comes down to the environment that your ancestors came from. Most human variation in terms of looking at races occurs between any one so-called race than it does occur between the races themselves. Franz Boas was one of the first academics and first anthropologists to present this type of thinking. He said racial classifications as they are set now, meaning at the early 1900s, he said these do not work. They do not make sense. He said if you want to explain difference, look to the environment that people have found themselves in, because it is the environment that is impacting them and is impacting whether or not a feature is being selected for, or whether or not this feature is seen to not have a benefit to that group of individuals. And so Boas at this time, in early 1900s again, states that racial categories do not work, they do not exist. He goes so far as to claim, which has now been demonstrated, that there is more variation between any one so-called race than there is between any one so-called race and another race. So what he said is that there's more variation to be found within the so-called white race than there is to be found between the so-called white race and the so-called black race. There is no point at which we can say this is where the white race ends and this is where the black race begins. It is impossible to do this. There is in terms of genetic variations, all races have this kind of hodgepodge mix of genetic variation. There is no genetic feature which is exclusive to any one race, which means that there are no racial categories. Again, it does not work in terms of biology, it does not work in terms of science. So, what is race then? Race is a cultural construct. It is a form of identity and social hierarchy that refers to these presumed hereditary and physical characteristics of a group of people. These differences are unfortunately and incorrectly correlated with behavioral attributes. So if we want to look at our understanding of race and where race came from, the modern idea of race began to emerge in the early 1500s as Europeans set out to explore and colonize the world. As they came into contact with other individuals, they looked to these phenotypic, again, observable features, made note of them, just like what happened with the Rwanda example. They looked at these phenotypic features and they categorized people in terms of them being primitive and in terms of them being civilized. European culture was seen to be the most civilized culture at this time, and that still holds as a truth, I guess, in terms of classification now. And we've obviously demonstrated that linear evolution has no value, but people still think in these terms. And so the Europeans are seeing these individuals, they're classifying based upon these observable features as to whether they're primitive, whether they're civilized. This type of thinking continues on from the 1500s and starts to become solidified and starts to become normalized to the extent that we believe this to be an absolute objective truth. In the mid-1950s, people are not only being categorized into groups according to their skin color, but each race was actually given what was thought to be a different temperament, or was assigned what was thought to be a different temperament. So people were not only categorizing individuals, but also speaking in terms of how they were going to behave should you encounter them. So here's a small list of groups of individuals, their skin color, which was thought to be a truth again in the 1950s, and then also the temperament that they were thought to have. So indigenous people of the Americas with red skin were thought to be savage and warlike. Africans with black skin were thought to be lethargic and slow-witted. Asians with yellow skin were thought to be cunning and devious, and Europeans with white skin were thought to be reflective and rational. Again, this is taking us back to what happened in Rwanda, where you have colonial officials stepping in, telling individuals there is distinct groups, the Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa, assigning characteristics to each group, and then applying privilege to one group and denying privilege to another. And so we start to see one group gaining benefits, starting to find success within the society, basically on the backs of the other individuals. So if we're saying that discrete races do not exist in biology, does that mean that racism does not exist? The obvious answer to this, I would hope for you guys, is that you see that no, of course, just because we're saying that races do not exist in biology, that does not mean by any stretch of the imagination that racism does not exist. Racism is the social construct. It is the cultural form of hierarchy with people. So again, we can apply privilege to individuals and deny privilege to others. And it is impossible to think that just because we say race does not exist in biology that we're all going to get along. It would take us 2 seconds to find other ways to categorize people, to deny privilege to some and apply it to other groups. And race is such an unfortunate, I guess, category within our thinking, and yet we don't challenge it. It is not that not that far in our past, that it, determined who you could marry. It determined whether you could go to a school, whether you could vote, whether you could own land, buy a house. Up until 1967 in the United States, it was illegal to marry someone who was not of the same race as you. 1967 might seem like a million years ago to you guys, but it was not that long ago, right? Laws down in the United States that relate to race, and even in Canada, because our visible minority category is so fluid, mean that I can go from being white to being black in the United States simply because I go from one state to another state. And we think that it is bound in biology, right? We think that people are born with it and it's something that they can't shed. In 1982, Susie Phipps discovered in the United States that her birth certificate indicated that she was colored, yet she had lived her life believing that she was a white person. So finding this out, she sues the state of Louisiana to have her birth certificate changed to indicate that she was in fact white. Just the fact alone that she felt it was so important to change her birth certificate from saying colored to white should tell you guys just how powerful racism is and the fear of racism is. It should not matter what it says on her birth certificate in terms of this categorization, but obviously it does, enough to the point where she's suing the state of Louisiana. So she sues the state of Louisiana. They do an investigation. They find out that, in fact, she was the great granddaughter of a black slave who married a Frenchman. So according to 1972 Louisiana state law, anyone with at least 1/32 Negro blood was considered to be black. Therefore, she was legally black and she lost her appeal to the state to have her birth certificate changed. So this should hopefully show to you guys that the race is a very difficult thing to think about. It's a very difficult category within our society. The concept of race is something that people tend not to challenge, and they should challenge it, and they should also keep in mind, though, even if we say it doesn't exist in biology, that doesn't take power away from it. In fact, it gives it a degree of power. Because if I'm a policymaker, if I'm a lawmaker, I have the power to determine what race you are. Now, that can, of course, affect your future options, your future jobs, your future relationships. All these different things can be affected simply because of what race you are determined to be. So it's a very, very powerful issue. Now, ethnicity. Ethnicity is often, unfortunately, interchanged with race, but ethnicity is something that is very different from race. And so we will end this lecture by looking at what ethnicity is and what the difference is between ethnicity and race. So ethnicity is the linguistic and cultural characteristics and heritage that a person identifies with. Ethnicity involves cultural traits that are passed on from one generation to the next. Ethnicity is an identity based upon a person's perception of their cultural heritage, the language that they speak, the religion and traditions that they follow, and in some cases, their perceived race. Ethnicity involves self-identification, which is something that race doesn't need, right? You are born with race. So how is race different than ethnicity? Ethnicity is often confused as race or with race, but it is not as strongly based upon biological considerations. Ethnicity involves what you do, and you need to do things that are deemed to be appropriate for and by your ethnic group. Race, you don't need to do anything. Race just involves you being. It is rooted in the biology of your body, or so people believe, and it does not change throughout your life. So again, ethnicity involves you actually having to do things. It involves your self-identification, whereas race is just something that you are thought to be born with, and you don't have to do anything in order to be in possession of it. So I can be born German, if we're going to classify German as being a race. I don't need to do anything to be German. People assume it's just part of my biology. If I want to take on the ethnicity of being a Ukrainian, I can do that. Most people aren't going to think I'm 100% Ukrainian, but I could look to the languages, I could look to the traditions, I could look to the perception of the values that people have, the religion, etc., and I could perform what it means to be a Ukrainian in terms of ethnicity. But that does not ever change the race that I have, or the race that I am perceived to have. So again, ethnicity involves the things that you do, and race involves you just being. It's rooted in your body, or at least it's perceived to be rooted in your body. And this ends the lecture for this section, and I thank you very much.